forestry industry. Now, China currently has a very small forestry sector. And so China has become the largest importer of pulp in the world. But the massive subsidies that are going into these sectors, the forestry sector in particular, subsidies to buy saplings, free electricity, free land, loans that never have to be repaid, all of these things are geared to making China less dependent on imports of wood from New Zealand and other countries.
Okay, let's talk about the free trade deal, because, James, a couple of years ago, we signed on to a free trade agreement with China. What do you see as the benefits?
Well, we get, I guess we get products into China at lower tariff rates, and they're going to be progressive over the next sort of 10 years, I guess, for some particular areas, but gives us better market access for the products that we are selling. It depends on which products and what prices we will be selling into that market. Fonterra
now, of course, has been in China for years. They're looking at going in and setting up more manufacturing plants, as I understand it. What are the dangers for them, Usha?
Well, Fonterra hasn't had a great deal of success in its joint venture partner in China. But some of the dangers, of course, include non-tariff barriers, if Fonterra doesn't have a joint venture partner that's Chinese. And then, of course, the giving away of intellectual property or IP. What is it that makes Fonterra unique? And Fonterra has to really take a hard look at what that is, and also wonder if they're just handing it over on a silver platter to somebody else, breeding competitors.
Of course, one of the big issues here for both of you to address this is the Crafer Farm controversy. These are the Chinese people that would like to buy up some of the biggest dairy farms in the country. James, what's your take on it?
Well, I guess some of the drivers are going towards the areas that have the most money, and China has been saving a lot over the past few years. There's a bit of an imbalance going to some of the emerging economies because they do have the money. They hold the money bags at the moment, and the developed economies, the US, the Europeans, and to some extent us here in New Zealand, then we haven't been saving as much as what we could have. So they are holding the power, and in some instances, then they can take some opportunities. And you know, the government's come out with some changes over the past week, but of course, you know, only time will tell where that's going to go, and there's got to be a bit of balance as to where those talks do go.
And of course, we've just seen Bright Dairy, one of the biggest Chinese dairy companies, coming in and putting in taking a 51% stake in Synlait down south. Is that a good thing?
Well, I guess Synlait have for some time been looking at bringing in an investor, and Bright Dairy's come in with the money. It does give them some access into the Asian market, and I guess they can take products into an established dairy company into the Asian and Chinese market. So there's going to be some benefits there. They can invest further into their plants, expand more into different products. So there's going to be some benefits there. I guess they're not selling any strategic land assets, but they are giving away some other downstream manufacturing.
I think also that it's difficult for people in the West to understand when you go onto your computer, for example, if you're living in China, everything is being censored.
Not everything. I mean, people are watching you.
300,000 censors operating throughout the country.
Yes.
That's phenomenal.
In my spare time, I blog for the Huffington Post, which is one of the large blogging sites in the world. And my latest post, I think it came online last night about midnight, talked about these people. They are called the 50-cent party in China. There are about 300,000 of them that guide opinion on social networking sites in China, including Twitter and Facebook and now the Huffington Post, and also local Chinese sites. Yes, they are. China, as you know, China follows a different model of development. It doesn't, for example, have freedom of information or free speech.
So it's completely different.
It is completely different.
Do you think do you think Kiwis are perhaps a little naive about dealing with such a giant emerging economy?
I don't think it's just the Kiwis. I think there's the tantalizing market that China presents. Unfortunately, it's not just the Kiwis that have been deluded by the potential size of that market. It's often an illusion. The Chinese market for many products is very small. For example, the Chinese market for autos, even though this year and last year China overtook the United States to become the largest producer of autos in the world, the Chinese market for autos without those massive subsidies is fairly small. It's about the size of a market in Europe, for example, one of the smaller countries in Europe. So one really has to see not just 1 billion potential customers, but government policies and the purchasing power of these customers.
Here's a question for you. If you were sitting with John Key and the bosses of Fonterra, what advice would you have for them about doing business with China in the coming 5 years?
Oh, I'd say tread carefully and wall off critical technologies. Isolate what it is that makes New Zealand competitive.
What do you think it is that makes New Zealand competitive?
Oh, I think there's several things about New Zealand's image, including the dairy industry, for example, and certain things that make New Zealand special. New Zealanders' special relationship, almost a spiritual relationship between New Zealanders and their land, for example. And that has to be looked at within the context of New Zealand and how the development of trade with China is going to be affecting that relationship.
Now, it's interesting that also in other Asian countries, India, I see that the Economic Times in India, James, is floating a story that Fonterra is in preliminary talks to supply thousands of cows to the dairy industry there. What is the potential for us if we got involved in something like that?
Well, I guess we would be exporting some of our technology, some of our genetics. The dairy industry in China is the largest in the world, but you know, the average farmer has 1 or 2 cows, so it's quite different to the industry here. I would imagine that those cows are in different circumstances, different feed environments, not as productive as they are here. So there would be some pretty significant impacts on the Indian dairy industry for some changes here in New Zealand.
Okay, and quickly, just before we wrap on this section, Usha, what do you think about the Crayford Farm controversy and Chinese being allowed, and other overseas investors being allowed to come in and buy very valuable farmland?
Actually, I think this is less China's fault than the New Zealand government's fault. It's the New Zealand government's duty to protect New Zealand interests. And China is just doing the entrepreneurial thing here.
Thank you very much. Coming up, Bill English heads to the UK and Washington. What's up? But first, answer this. According to our finance minister, by 2015, Australia and China will represent what percentage of our exports? The answer when we come back. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, according to our finance minister, by 2015, Australia and China will represent what percentage of our exports? The answer, 40% of our exports will go to Australia and China. Although some, like you, Usha, think that might be a little optimistic.
Well, I'm not sure about optimistic. I think it's a rosy picture, but I'm really more worried about what New Zealand is going to be exporting and what it's going to be importing from China, because I think that's going to decide the structure of New Zealand, who works where, and that's a really important issue.
What should we be concentrating on?
We should be concentrating on whether New Zealand is exporting things that New Zealand wants to be competitive in. For example, is it looking at services in which New Zealand is investing, or is it looking at higher value-added manufacturing? Or has New Zealand been cornered into becoming just an exporter of commodities?
James, what are you thinking? You're looking at all the data going forward.
Yeah, I think, I mean, from an economic perspective, then the good news story for New Zealand over perhaps the next 20 years is that there's an emerging population in China that are wanting more higher value proteins, and New Zealand is an exporter of those proteins. So I guess I'd be keen to hear Usha's opinion on some of the other sectors that China may be looking to get into and the subsidies and what impact that might have on agriculture here in New Zealand.
Well, it's not just the subsidies and the impact on the production of agricultural commodities, but also who's holding the technology for the development of certain sophisticated products within the agricultural sector, who holds the brand names, and basic questions, where's the higher quality milk going to go, for example? Is it all going to be siphoned off into China? What do New Zealanders give up? There's a saying in economics, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And it's time New Zealand started giving a hard-nosed appraisal of the cost that New Zealand is going to be paying.
Is it going to be possible, though, to have really an equitable relationship with such a giant economy that has all of these government subsidies that, let's face it, the government rules still with an iron fist?
Well, I think it's an excellent question. I mean, because size does matter.
As we know, Fonterra got into trouble before with a milk plant in China with the tainted baby formula scandal. You know, it's possible that this could happen again, isn't it? And then what does that do to our brand?
Oh, I think that's an excellent question, because quality control issues are key here. If Fonterra, for example, moves all its production to China, can it guarantee that a toy fiasco, such as, you know, China faced, or another fiasco like that wouldn't affect Fonterra's export markets?
Let's move now to Europe, of course. Our Finance Minister, Bill English, is over there. The picture here is not looking very rosy, James, and he's looking at probably David Cameron's kingdom of austerity cuts that he's made over there. What do you think he's going to learn?
I think he's probably feeling pretty good about himself, actually, if he's in the UK at the moment, just because of the position that the UK is in currently and the measures that they're going to have to take, the cuts that they're going to have to impose. It's not the same situation that we're here in New Zealand. I mean, the government's just decreased taxes in a lot of areas on the 1st of October. That's not going to happen in the UK, you know, to the same extent. But he was on the wires earlier on in the week talking about the currency and how the effect that that's going to have on our export sector. A little bit uncomfortable about that, and also that economic growth here in New Zealand is going to be fairly soft for a little while. That over the past 18 months, then consumption has been down. Households are saving a lot more than they have previously, and that's going to have some impacts on our economy. And you know, of course, you know, when you think in context of the New Zealand economy, then while things aren't looking that sharp, they are still looking sharper than most other places.
But I think we're all agreed we're not out of the woods yet, and we have to, as you say, Usha, move very, very carefully with these new emerging international markets.
Right. Look at all sides of the issue, generally more than two.
Thanks to my guests, ASB rural economist James Shortall and Usha Haley, international business professor at Massey University. We'd love to hear your feedback, so drop me a line on the website. Remember to check out my weekly blog. We'll give the last word to Zhongguing Zhu. He's a beverage magnate and the richest man in China, worth $12 billion US. According to Wealth Watchers, China now has the largest number of billionaires anywhere in the world, about 400 to 500 of them. Keep the faith. See you next time.